Thank you very much for the invitation to spend a couple of weeks at IFO because I'm quite interested in what the German view of Brexit is, and rather than read it in the Daily Mail or the Telegraph or other papers, I'd rather be here and talk to people and see what's going on. And I've seen over the last week or so what we would say is two groups who have blinked at the whole prospect of a no deal. Certainly the European Union and Germany have blinked, realizing that we could go over the precipice in terms of having a no deal and what chaos that would bring. The other group is the Brexiteers, who voted down, along with Remainers and others, the withdrawal agreement. And now they're worried that there may be a pulling back from Brexit, or there might be a Brexit which would be not really a Brexit. So now they're saying as long as we get rid of the backstop, we could vote for the deal. So what do we have? As you can see from German media and German discussions, and maybe even watching what's happening in the United Kingdom, British politics has been in disarray. The government's strategy, if we could call it that, has been incoherent. So what we have is no strategy. What we have is tactics. So we don't have a longer term view about what's happening with Brexit. So you've got 2 years where the United Kingdom just looked around trying to work out something and came up with something called the Chequers Agreement, which wasn't accepted in the United Kingdom and was pushed back by the European Union. We got to a point where it was very difficult to get any kind of agreement because of the red lines of Theresa May. No customs union, no internal market, and no governance by the European Court of Justice. So where does that leave us with the government? Theresa May is damaged goods, and she's dead in the water in terms of where she can go in terms of her credibility. But you have to give it to her. Her resilience has been unbelievable, right? That's for sure. She had a Conservative Party confidence vote, no confidence vote, which was initiated by the Brexiteers. She won that by 200 to 117, which is not an overwhelming mandate, considering quite a lot of people who voted are what we would say are on the payroll, who are either ministers, cabinet ministers, etc., or private parliamentary secretaries. So she is a lame duck. But then it went further than that she suffered a humiliating defeat on the 15th of January, the withdrawal agreement was put forward by 432 votes to 202, which is a massive defeat. She then really goaded Jeremy Corbyn into calling a no confidence vote in the government, which she won by 325 to 306. This is could be used as an attritional kind of process over time, but we don't have any time anymore. So now we have a government who seems to be stalling in terms of Brexit, in terms of running the clock down. So we get to the point near the 29th of March where it's either her deal or a no deal exit. So that's where we'll look at some of the scenarios. And what I would do is I'll speak for about half an hour, 35 minutes. I mean, I've got a PowerPoint in here with lots of different PowerPoints, but I think we should deal with the here and now and what's immediately in front of us. And in the Q&A, if you've got something you really want to bring up that I haven't discussed, I'm quite happy to take those questions. The Financial Times a couple of days ago said if Parliament can't resolve Brexit, a new referendum is needed. extend Article 50, that means extend Article 50, test support for other exit options, and a referendum, obviously. The FT has been all over the place on this because a few weeks ago it was supporting Theresa May's deal. So business will take any deal that gives them certainty. So that comes to the fact of where we are now. And at this very moment, we are heading for an exit with no deal. That means without any further action, we will be out. And that means that the governments and businesses in the European Union, as well as the United Kingdom, will be in a very bad place. In an environment where we've got a China-US trade war, where there's a lot of uncertainty in the markets. So you see that in Belgium, 4 out of 5 businesses are not ready for no deal exit. And in Germany, you see lots of different discussions going on, and the latest one was Dr. Tom Enders from Airbus saying this is disgraceful what's happening in terms of the whole Brexit process, and obviously Airbus will have to consider taking out its presence in the United Kingdom, which other organizations have already done. The Japanese foreign direct investment, which has been in there for decades in the United Kingdom, they've been in there because the United Kingdom has been a member of the single market. So you've also got Brexiteers who have supported and funded the campaign for Brexit, but who are starting to think about the facts on the ground. And Dyson is a clear example of that, that he's going to relocate his business to Singapore. So, unless Britain revokes Article 50, or the EU agrees to extend beyond the 29th of March, or there's a satisfactory agreement somehow magically presented in the next few weeks, UK will leave. The immediate damage would be enormous because we've seen what the contingency planning is of the United Kingdom. It's fair to say it's a joke, right? Having 80 trucks going down the motorway, and actually when there's thousands going through Dover was silly. Also, to say that you're going to not have really many problems when you don't have the customs officials to deal with all the customs documentation, you don't have the trained people for that, there's going to be backlogs all the way around the line. So you've got all that happening. You've got one dredger who's dredging Ramsgate Harbour to make that available, but nothing has happened in Ramsgate Harbour to show that that could actually take on any kind of overload. Here in Germany, you've had leading members of the SPD, CDU and Green parties having a very concerned sort of discussion about what's happening with the no-deal Brexit. And you've had quotes like heavy turbulence for the whole of the EU and also for Germany from the Farmers Association. You've got also, unsurprisingly, Sigmund Gabriel, who's quite knowledgeable about these things, wrote in the Handelsblatt, the EU should be ready to make more concessions to the UK to allow more time for negotiations, adding the British withstood a bigger crisis than Brexit and will overcome this economic crisis at some stage. But that's by no means assured that Europe will survive Britain's departure. And of course, we've had the narrative that, of course, Europe will survive that. It is possible. But Europe has a lot of problems. The Eurozone is one particular problem, and despite the Aachen Declaration, which was very thin in terms of substance, and in you know the dysfunctional nature of the Eurozone, there are problems still there. we have populist parties all over Europe now, not only in Eastern Central Europe, but in Western Europe as well. And we've got a problem where there is an Italian government who might call into question at some stage its membership of the euro. So, you know, there are a lot of difficulties. Plus, at the same time, the United Kingdom is going to be a disruptive influence on this. So, each day we get pronouncements by different members of the European Commission, the European Parliament, national governments, and it's very difficult to work out where we're going with this. Is this negotiating stances, or is this just a reflection of what I said earlier? That we're not into a strategy, but tactically every day we're just dealing with what's in front of us. So Mr. Barnier's comments at one stage a few days ago said that Brussels would resist extending a 2-year negotiating process under Article 50 to allow the UK continue debating its preferred outcome. The prospect of the UK remaining in the EU beyond the planned 29th of March was increased when the Labour Party has decided maybe to actually take a grip of this process within the Parliament. Because as the government is no longer able to govern, the Parliament might have to take over this process to save it. So what does that mean? So you're going to hear a lot about this in the next few weeks, because next week will be the first amendments to go to Parliament, and every week afterwards, and they will have a telling effect on whether we are going to avoid a no deal Brexit. So they will become more proactive, and they want to amend the business of the House and motions brought forward by the government, and to set out to format the debate in terms of standing orders and the procedures that are going on in the United Kingdom. And this has happened before because Theresa May didn't want to have a vote on the deal, and she was forced to by Parliament. First, there's two problems here. No agreement without some form of backstop. We can discuss a lot of different things, but it's quite clear from the European Commission and also by the European Parliament that they will not consider, under the circumstances of where we are with the withdrawal agreement, any amendment to the backstop. And I'll give some reasons for that later on, but it has to do with the fact that you're supporting a member state against a state that is leaving. You don't want a hard border, and it would call into question any kind of compromise the whole process of how the European Union is set up and what it means. So this insurance policy that may come in terms of regulatory customs alignment that facilitates an invisible border between Northern Ireland and Ireland will endure. No negotiated Brexit will exclude this backstop, and no Irish government, if the EU or if Germany or France had decided to actually think about stepping back for this, I think the Irish government would veto that, and that would be the end of that. Because the Irish government cannot move towards any compromise on the backstop. It would be out of power very, very quickly. And at the moment it has an agreement with an opposition party, Fianna Fáil. And if they look like they were softening their stance, there's Fianna Fáil on one side, there's Sinn Féin on the other side, and there are other parties that would call this into question. So that is not really going to happen. So all this noise that British papers are building up, the Telegraph, the Mail on Sunday, the Mail and other papers, the BBC, unfortunately we've had a situation with our media that the BBC now has become complicit in not really searching for facts, and on the one hand it's trying to have one side, on the other hand it has the other argument, and when the other argument or one argument is false, they're not calling out that position when it's clearly wrong. They're just giving two views and not trying to mediate that and investigate that a bit more. So you've got this process. So the view from Downing Street and much of the cabinet is May cannot make necessary conditions on customs union, let alone single market or another referendum. Why? When Cameron actually initiated the referendum process, it wasn't for the national interest. Cameron did that because he was being flanked on the right by UKIP. And they were doing well in European Parliament elections, and they were taking a substantial amount of votes in national elections without getting seats. So they needed to try and kill off that process by having a referendum, which he thought he'd never have, because the Liberals were in coalition when he made his Bloomberg speech. They never thought in 2015 that they would have to stand by that. They did have to stand by that. It was a mistake. And for Conservative Party interests, rather than the national interest, they went ahead with the referendum. Theresa May keeps talking about the national interest, but what she's really talking about is her job and the Conservative Party and keeping it united. And that's what's happening now. If she was really interested in reaching out to the 48% who had voted to remain, she would have done that a long time ago. But they've made the referendum a be-all and end-all of everything in saying, this is the people's will. It would be undemocratic to do anything other than leave. We have to say, legally, the referendum was advisory. We have to accept there were a lot of different reasons why people voted to leave the European Union. In every referendum, the actual question is not always the thing that people actually answer. There was a lot of austerity between 2010 and 2015 after the financial crisis. That was one thing. People were unhappy about the amount of globalization and how that was affecting their life. And they'd had 35 years of constant attack on the European Union in the papers and in the media. 80% of the papers were attacking it. It was actually amazing that 48.1% of the population actually voted for the European Union. So it just showed you. And you've got to remember, Brexit is an English phenomena. It's an identity crisis now that's happening with the English in terms of this process. Northern Ireland has voted in the referendum by a good majority to stay within the European Union. You wouldn't know it because the DUP, who had was against, was a Brexiteer party, now a member, well, sort of a pseudo-member of the government supporting them and the supply agreement, are in government. And that also has corrupted the Northern Ireland process because the government can't be seen to be an honest broker in Northern Ireland. And we're already seeing implications of what might happen if there's a hard border in Northern Ireland. And remember, 3,000 people died in Northern Ireland during the conflicts there. So she's gone on and she's put forward these things, trying to hold the party together, trying to keep like Boris Johnson in the party, David Davis in the party, trying to keep on board Rees-Mogg in the party, in her line, and she's not been able to do that. So now we'll find over the next week, starting with votes on the 29th of January, whether a cross-party majority can be assembled against a no-deal scenario. Because what we're looking at this stage is extend Article 50 and stop a no-deal exit. That has to be an interest of also European countries to think about that. But I would understand that any extension of a Article 50 would have to have some substance to it. And again, I will come to some of that, why I think it's right that the question mark should be put on that, because you just can't have an extension just so that the Brits can argue for another 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. There has to be something a bit more substantive to it. So I won't go into the deepness of the different amendments, only to say that names like Yvette Cooper from the Labour Party and Dominic Grieve and others will be names that you will become familiar with in terms of the amendment. And also you have a problem that the Labour Party has some members that are in, quite a few members that are in constituencies that voted to leave, and who have already flagged up that they will vote against these amendments with the government. So that means you need more rebellions, a rebellion from the Conservative MPs against their own party to actually get a majority for these amendments to go through. And what may happen also is that you'll see more resignations from the cabinet, because at some stage the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, and Amber Rudd also will think that their position's untenable if we're going towards a no-deal Brexit. So they may resign and vote against the government. They can't do that at the moment because they're in the cabinet, but they've been having their meetings with other members to discuss that. So you can see there's a really big mess there. So Parliament needs to try to agree something in terms of at least stopping Brexit, then trying to ask for a sensible extension. One of these amendments says 9 months, but MacDonald has said more like 3 months would be more sustainable, because there's a whole discussion about the legality of Britain being within the European Union still, with the European Parliament elections going on, and what that would mean. So we can come to that in Q&As, what that is really about. Article 50 process doesn't carry always support in the bureaucracy or in the European Parliament. Here in Germany, the German Liberal MP Konstantin Güler warned that the Article 50 extension may threaten to delegitimize the European Parliament and the new Commission, which is a fair point. The EU should not allow that chaos to infect its own institutions. So that's one perspective. So even if the European Parliament issue can be fudged, the UK, if they were allowed to stay and allowed to have a role in the European Parliament, for example, either by nominated members or elected members, could influence the selection of successors of Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk. And they would have a view over the long-term budget. And that would be a lot of leverage for the UK to have to shape a new withdrawal agreement. So this is why Brussels and this is why the Parliament are concerned. So it's not coming from nowhere, and it's not being the Europeans nasty to the UK. They have their own interests, believe it or not, and you'd never read that sometimes in the UK media, that, you know, there is another side to this negotiation. So it appears now, I've mentioned Barnier had talked about this Article 50. It appears then the following day he needed to clarify his statements. And his statement really was that he dismissed the prospect of UK automatically securing an extension to the 2-year negotiation period under the Article 50 process. So he said, if the question is to be asked, heads of state and governments would ask 3 questions. For what reason? For how long? And they would have a third concern. That is, possible extension of this would interfere with the workings of the European Parliament in May. So, you know, it's repetition of what he said before, but he's been clearer about what questions are going to be asked. So we've got the Article 50 process, which we can discuss later in more detail. We've got the no-deal Brexit and its implications. Then we hear about the referendum process. And then if you really want to get depressed about what might be happening, this is an interesting one, because then, you know, you have the issue of, well, you had a referendum, now you're having another referendum. But remember, and I know Nigel Farage doesn't like to be quoted when he's actually said something that might be counter to his own arguments. Before the last referendum, he said, if the result is 52 to 48 for the Remain side, this would be unfinished business. Right? That's a fact. He made that remark in a tabloid, and it was quoted. So that means that he was going to go for another referendum. And lo and behold, it went the other way. And now this is in stone, this referendum result, contrary to what he had said before the referendum. So the Parliament would have to pass legislation for the poll to take place. Exactly the way the long process that it took to actually get a UK referendum for June 2016. So how quickly could that referendum be held? This is a fundamental point for what I've just mentioned before, right? So we've got out of the no-deal Brexit issue. We've got the extension. How long is the extension going to be? Because this will also have an implication for if there's a general election. So the University of College London Constitutional Unit published a report saying it would take 22 weeks to have a referendum. So that's quite a long time. That would be made up of 12 weeks to pass the legislation and prepare for the poll, and a 10-week regulated period of a campaign. What would the question be? So we have a commission that would look at the question so that the options are clear, simple and neutral, so people could understand what they're voting on. A regulated period, a framework set out. So you'd have all that, and then you'd have, in this time, a designated campaign team. So in the last election, referendum, you had a couple of Leave campaigns. One was more Tory Brexiteers, and one was more a UKIP-led coalition. The Tory Brexiteers were able to get Boris Johnson, Gove and others were able to become the designated Leave, and they get money and they get the official recognition. Doesn't mean the other one fades away, it's just there, it's not as officially designated. More importantly, and this is where we get complications, and this is where you'll start tearing your hair out, because if you're going to have a referendum, and I can assure you that everyone says, oh, this is too complicated for me, there's a single two-way vote between a Brexit deal and a Remain. There's a single two-way vote between no deal and Remain. A single two-way vote between accepting and rejecting the deal. A single three-way vote, the deal, no deal, Remain. Taking second preferences into account, right? So you had single transferable voting, right? A two-stage vote, first asking whether you want to remain or leave. Obviously, if you want to remain, you don't have the second vote, which would look at deal or no deal. All these options have their drawbacks. There's no consensus so far on any of those. We're not got there yet, but at least people are thinking. What would the franchise be? Who would be able to vote? So would 16 to 17-year-olds be able to vote? EU citizens in the UK? Probably not, right? EU citizens in the Scottish referendum were allowed to vote, right? But the biggest democratic problem I feel about this was British citizens who were outside the United Kingdom, who had paid tax in the country, who lived in Spain, who lived in Germany and other countries, were not allowed to vote. Right? So on the Costa del Sol and some other places, people would probably have voted Brexit, but quite a large proportion of those people, understanding that their own legal status in these other countries would be called into question if the United Kingdom left, would have voted to remain. And there's a democratic deficit that's not talked about very much, right? These are British citizens, they've got their passports, or they did have their passports because, like myself, for a much longer time than most of these people, I have Irish citizenship as well as British citizenship. But it's amazing how many British people have found out that they've got Irish relatives now. And Gabriel was on Buy and Dry yesterday talking about Brexit. There was another discussion the other night, I think Sunday night or Monday evening, where Kate Connolly, who's the Berlin correspondent of The Guardian, and she has Irish connections as well, but she's a British citizen, right? Because you can identify quite a lot of people in the United Kingdom with that kind of background. But she's taken German citizenship so that she's built a life here, she's in Berlin. And it's quite, I mean, you look at North Rhine-Westphalia last year, the biggest group that actually got German citizenship were the Brits in North Rhine-Westphalia. So, you know, there are people who are making their choices because they're unhappy with what's happened. So this franchise is an issue about democratic legitimacy. The question then would be, would the second referendum be final? If Remain won, would we say, like we would in a schoolyard, oh, let's have it best of three? Right? So you've got the situation where you've got a win for the Remain side of 52-48, and then the other side saying, well, we want another referendum, but at least we'd still be in, and then we could discuss those issues. And we have to say fundamentally that the problem has been created by the politicians ignoring the problems of the people in this, and they're finding a way of getting attention. And I suppose, you know, I've talked to quite a lot of Brexiteers, and they have a lot of justified views about things that are happening to them in their particular parts of England. I mean, I'm based in London, but I do travel around, and when you get out of the London bubble, you do see that people have very hard lives and very difficult times. So it's a situation where I think you need to address those problems. Can you do it in this day and age? You certainly can't do it with the politicians that are operating in Westminster at the moment, who seem to ignore these problems quite happily. So there needs to be a step change in that, because whatever happens, even if there was a referendum and it was won, British society culturally, have you heard cultural wars in the United States over different single issue problems, is going to be divided for a very long time. Scotland will be a pro-Remain. Northern Ireland will be a pro-Remain. Wales did vote for Brexit just. We have to see what happens there. And then you've got the big cities of the United Kingdom and London voted Remain, but vast swathes of England voted to leave. So whatever happens, we've got a division in our society. So, you know, dealing with the parliamentary elections, move on. So, just briefly, the general election. So, if she had failed in her confidence vote in the government, there would have probably been a general election. So, the only couple of ways that this can happen, really, is if, because we've got fixed-term parliaments, you need 2/3 majority of the Commons, or 464 MPs to vote for an election. Or a second is a simple majority where you get 50+1, but then you know, you have to pass the no confidence motion in the government, and then there would be a 2-week period where an alternative government could be formed. So there's a lot of process there. And the question would be, if there was an election, when Theresa May won her confidence vote, the Conservative Party confidence vote, she had to say to the people that she was lobbying, I will not run for Prime Minister the next time. And that didn't mean the next time in years to come, but the next time. So if that is going to be in a few months or in half a year, she won't be the candidate. What does that mean? It means we need a new leader of the Conservative Party. That will be fun. And so, so then the question will be, what kind of manifesto will the Conservative Party put to the nation? Because the Conservative Party is so divided at the moment about where it wants to go in terms of the withdrawal agreement, customs union, internal market, backstop. Getting a consensus around something on Brexit is going to be extremely difficult. And internal polling at the moment in Conservative HQ is showing that Corbyn would probably win the election and could form a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats and the SNP. Liberal Democrats pro-Remain, SNP pro-Remain. Jeremy Corbyn, very much a Brexiteer, even though he was supposed to be on the Remain side. His whole voting record has been pretty much anti-EU. John MacDonald, the deputy leader and the shadow chancellor, is someone who is quite interested in power. So maybe he may be someone that can push that along. And then there's somebody else called Keir Starmer, who's the Brexit secretary, shadow Brexit secretary, who's been educating the front bench or the leadership of the party about what really Europe means and what Brexit is all about. So time is of the essence, so I won't go into too much depth about the general election because that's a bit further on from what we're sort of talking about, and also to give you a chance to ask in Q&A. So I'll spend another 5, 6, 7 minutes and then we'll go. Revoking Article 50 is simple. If the United Kingdom decided to revoke the notice of Article 50, that would be it. So it would require an Act of Parliament. It would remain in the EU on broadly the same terms. The problem is, tactically, or you might think it might be a strategy, we could revoke it now to get ourselves out of the hole and then reintroduce it again at some other stage when we were having a nervous breakdown like we are at the moment, right? So that could be something that could happen. So the European Court of Justice says that we can do that, but we have to show goodwill when we're doing that revoking. Again, that's further down the line. Yep. Well, this is a very good question because normally that would be the government. But if the government is in a situation where it may be forced by the Parliament to do that, the Parliament by that stage might have taken over the agenda. But I would think we would have gone beyond that and we would have had a new government in, and maybe then that government would actually revoke it if it came to that. But as I say, that's further down the line. Some things that we can talk about in the Q&A are the different options. Again, the immediate one is, just to reiterate, is to avoid a no-deal exit, to look at the extension of Article 50 on what terms we could do that, whether there would be a referendum, and this will come up in some of the things that are going to be happening in the Parliament. These are actual, statements that we should go for a referendum at some stage, and the Labour Party seems to be moving in that direction. And the election and the revoking of the of Article 50 are further out. The election's nearer revoking Article 50. That then would come to the point, which is quite interesting, is if the withdrawal agreement is not really working for us, and it's not working for the EU, and it doesn't carry enough support, what are the options? The options are many. The options are nebulous unicorns. Unicorns, the British have been very much into fantasy about what they could do during the campaign. They could make the best deals ever once we'd left the European Union. We would do deals with the United States. When we had our referendum, we didn't have Donald Trump as president, right? And it's one country that we've got actually a trade surplus with, right? So, and he's calling into question that beloved area of trade agreements, the WTO. He's calling into question the WTO not being fit for purpose for the United States, that is. So you've got a Norwegian model. And the Norwegian model is seen by a lot of people as being in the European Union, but without any decision-making power. So that's one model where you're still actually abiding by quite a lot of different rules as a member, but you don't have any say on it. The other one, which was going to say I'm a little bit skeptical about, but I'm going to discuss this more with Gabriel and Martin here in the Institute, who have, if you've been following what goes up on the website and the mailings and everything, are looking at an option of a Swiss model. And there can be some difficulties with that, and we can go into discussion about that and flush those out. We certainly will be thinking about doing that after sometime today, about how we go about that, because I think it is important for Germany and this institute to get involved, giving good ideas to Berlin and also to Brussels, to be ready to actually propose something and have something on the table. I think that's important. And then, of course, the WTO is a model that the Brexiteers are quite interested in. They seem to be less interested in WTO now, as they panic about the fact that they might be taken down a road where there is no Brexit in actual fact. It's Brexit in name only, but we're still really attached at the hip with the European Union. So coming to a conclusion, and obviously you've got the other deal, which is the Canadian deal, but then that has some, there's Canada Dry, Canada +1, Canada +2, and everything else. So why are the EU, I said that earlier that I would come back to this, why are the EU looking at this Irish backstop and being tough on that? It's protecting its single market. The Irish border will, after all, after Brexit, become the EU's external border. So the border would have to be policed rigorously, prevent substandard goods and unsafe food entering the European system, and that's one. And also what I meant before, it's about solidarity with a member that's still within the club and a member that's leaving the club. And reality is that you cannot have a member leaving with some of the same terms that they had in the club. There has to be a signal sent, because at the time of the referendum, there was a lot of talk that this might be a trigger for a lot of other countries to consider their position within the European Union. As far as I can see at the moment, nobody else is considering this. Because they've seen the nightmare that is the Brexit process. So, in looking at this, Theresa May is lacking authority and credibility. This endgame, this Brexit endgame, threatens the preservation not simply of the British government, but of modern Britain. So, you've got Northern Ireland, where the DUP would probably not be that keen on going to a national election now, because to keep their 10 seats would be a hard ask for them, because they're losing support in the unionist community, farming community, because we won't have the CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, which Northern Ireland's done quite well out of, subsidies for those. So quite a lot of farmers are going to go to the wall and lose their businesses. And Northern Ireland voted to remain. So I think that they would find it very, very, very difficult. And it's the question now, under the Good Friday Agreement, that at some stage, when the time comes that there would be a vote on whether Northern Ireland would become a part of the Republic of Ireland, that debate has become live after Brexit. So that's a disintegration issue of the United Kingdom. Clearly, Sturgeon has put themselves out there in terms of it being pro-Remain and wanting to be a part of the EU. And even though they lost seats in the last election, because the Conservatives had a good candidate up there, and they were running not so much on Brexit or anything else, on their own national record. They'd been in government for quite a long time, so they were taking hits on education, childcare, and other things. If Britain leaves the European Union, then Scotland almost certainly will have another referendum which the SNP would have a very good chance of winning. That would mean that Scotland would go. I don't think Wales is an issue at this time. So you've got that. So there's not only the survival of the British government, but the survival of Britain and the disintegration of the United Kingdom as we know it. But what the Brexit process has shown is Westminster politics is insular. It's incapable of running a modern economy and society. And day by day, Westminster politics is showing itself to be more and more dysfunctional. If I may quote Clemens on a more happier note, a hard Brexit would be, with its huge costs, must be avoided. Both parties should return to the negotiating table and modify the agreement so that it's acceptable to all sides. Anything else would be an unacceptable policy failure. And I think that goes for both sides. That is exactly right. It would be an unacceptable policy failure. So where are we? No deal, no Brexit, or renegotiated withdrawal agreement. That's where we stand at the moment. Thank you very much.
So thanks very much for that interesting presentation. So you said Westminster politics is insular. There has been an idea of a citizens' assembly that's been floated around. Could you talk a little bit about what that would be, how that would work, and whether there's been any precedent for it?
Yeah, I mean, they had these, they've had a citizens' assembly. They've used this idea in the Republic of Ireland on policy issues, and they found it a very useful exercise to get experts and different opinions within society to actually feed in to into the process. So that is something that is very possible and has been discussed that the Labour Party would like to try and push out there in terms of maybe Sarah Wollaston, who's a Conservative MP and a chair of one of the groups, has brought that up and said, look, we could bring different people from different parts of the spectrum together, professionals, experts, and actually try and get some consensus. Now, it's interesting you should mention that, because if you go on the University of College London's website, they actually did something with another organisation where they had a Brexit citizens assembly. So they've already done that on a smaller scale. And what it is very good in doing, I think, is that you get people around there and you get the different views, and people that the average Joe or Joanna outside can actually look at and identify with, rather than, you know, a business person, an MP, a policy expert, or some celebrity. But they see these people and they're in there and they're giving their points of view. And what it does is it's an exchange of information, but it's an educating process as well, right? It's educating the Remain side about the concerns of the people who want to withdraw, and vice versa. And it's been interesting, the results. If you look on that website and that report, it's interesting to see some of the results there. That is a very informative process, and it leads to certain greater democracy. And as long as it's publicized and it's clear to everybody what's happening, then I think that might be an interesting way to go, but time consuming. And also nominating, it would be like one of these US court series where I'm the lawyer and I'm looking at the people who are the witnesses, and then I'm thinking, well, that one might be a bit too Brexiteer, or that one might be too much Remain. You have to get over that and actually try and balance the books in terms of the people that are there. But it's certainly something, I did consider that, but I've dealt with quite a lot of different things, but that is certainly an idea that's out there. And Sarah Wollaston, who's the MP for Totnes and who was supporting Brexit, is now a very strong Remainer, has now sort of, and her constituency is very much a Brexiteer constituency. She's pushed that forward, and she's it's gaining some traction in the background, I think, because it has been shown to be a very good way of dealing with, in Ireland, the abortion issue and things like that, you know, so when they had that discussion. So I think that's certainly one that's a runner.
Thanks, John. Because we are running out of time, I would suggest we collect 3 questions. I've got myself on the list, Niklas, and who else? Gabriel. Okay. So the question I have is, you know, maybe a bit stupid, kind of $1 million question. So assume you were the Prime Minister. You couldn't revoke Article 50, but you had to make a suggestion to Parliament about, you know, some kind of modification of the deal. The way forward, if you like. What would you suggest?
So am I taking all 3 questions first? Yeah.
So I'm wondering about a principal-agent problem between politicians and citizens in the UK. So do you think that preferences are decoupled, preferences of politicians and citizens? And if so, do you observe, because you also said that the guys at Westminster do not really care about the problems of the people, is there rebellion within the parties? Are new people entering the parties and trying to kick out the incumbents in the electoral districts?
John, since you have the Irish citizenship, we hear a lot about Ireland in this discussion and about the fear that violence could re-emerge there. Is this realistic, or is this made up? I mean, Ireland has changed. The time has, it's no longer so Catholic. Is the generation that is, young now? Is this really an option, or is this just, negotiation talk?
Okay. So let me run it backwards from there. No, it's not. It's not exaggerated that violence would happen. If you've been picking up news and if you Google, a bomb went off in Derry. 4 people were arrested, and other vehicles have been used to cause disturbances. So I think this is the start that there are people on both sides who are willing at a hard border, criminal elements as well as politically motivated people, to stir this up. Remember, with the Good Friday Agreement and what it led to was a sectarian party like the DUP working with a Republican party like Sinn Féin, because they won the Assembly elections. And it meant Ian Paisley working with Martin McGuinness, who, so Ian Paisley was a very hardline fundamentalist Protestant who had said the Pope is the worst evil in the world, and had shouted in the Parliament. And you had Martin McGuinness, who was a commander in the IRA. And they worked together, and everyone gave up something to get that agreement in the end. The EU was involved, but it was British government with Tony Blair, Irish government, Northern Ireland, and of course Bill Clinton was involved in that. What we see now is that there could be problems if there's a hard border. If you look at the signs that are going up on the border, and you see that some of them have been shot full of with bullets. That's shooting at signs at the moment. The next thing will be shooting at people. And 3,000 people died, and we shouldn't take that threat any less than we shouldn't underestimate that threat. Remember, the Prime Minister was nearly blown up in Brighton. The second Prime Minister had bombs lobbed into the garden of Number 10. All security people at a high level were shot dead, are blown up in the Parliament. This is a serious business when this starts happening, and innocent people get caught in that. So I think this is a very serious problem. To go back onto Nicholas's question, what the latest evidence is showing, and I know you're quite interested in this, is that party political affiliation of members in public is becoming less, and people are becoming more wedded to a Remain or Brexiteer narrative than they are to Labour, Lib Dem or Conservative. The problem is also to say that the Conservative Party is an ageing party with around 100,000 members. This is low. The Labour Party's got 500,000 members. It's the biggest social democratic socialist party in Europe. And it has a group called Momentum who are trying to bring it more democracy. That's what they would say. They are more Remainer. And the trade unions, May's meeting trade unionists today, most of those except for one are very much against what she's doing. One of them still wants to leave the UK. So there are some elements where there's a vibrant membership that they're still trying to drive forward. 500,000 members is a big catalyst towards you know, change within the party and maybe in society as a whole. But this Brexiteer Remain issue has become the narrative that people identify themselves with. And so you get questions about would you worry about if your daughter or son were going to actually be with a Remainer or a Brexiteer. It's kind of got that kind of level of debate. So there is a loosening of political alliances, and there are more sort of identification with this Brexit Remain. In terms of modification of the withdrawal agreement, I would find that really, really difficult, and I wouldn't have got myself into that situation in the first place if I was Prime Minister, because the basic point was that, you know, you have to know something about how the European Union works, and if Cameron had done his homework at the beginning to try and build up more alliances rather than going to Berlin and Merkel only, he would have actually done a better job of maybe getting more support for issues now that seem quite reasonable. The 5 issues that he's put out there seem quite, some of them seem sensible. So I wouldn't have got myself into that situation. I would have put everything on the table and seen what were the best deal I would have got. And if I was forced by the referendum to look for the best deal, you know, I would have had to deal with those rebellions that she would have dealt with. But drawing red lines at the beginning of the process on the single market, the customs union, and the ECJ is making life difficult for yourself. You need to try and see what the lie of the land. And what I wouldn't have done is I wouldn't have initiated Article 50 process until I knew what I was doing. Because that was the big error of the British government, to do that, to show a cheap shot, to show everyone I'm interested in Brexit, but not having any idea where I'm going to go with it. Until I had an idea where I was going to go with this process, I wouldn't have actually initiated the Article 50 process.
I think that proves that the wrong people get elected Prime Minister and the right people don't. John, thank you very much. John will be around a few days, so if you're interested, like myself, understanding this better, I suppose John would be available for meetings.
Of course.
Thanks
of course.
to you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.